todos, mais uma live do Identificado no canal João Marcelo. Hoje, mais uma live internacional com um convidado muito especial, Kevin Randle, que é tenente-coronel reformado do Exército Americano, servindo na Guerra do Vietnã e na Guerra do Iraque. Possui graduação em jornalismo, mestrado e doutorado em psicologia, e um segundo mestrado em estudos militares. Investiga o fenômeno OVNI há mais de 50 anos, tendo escrito mais de 25 livros sobre o tema, e é considerado o maior especialista do caso Roswell atualmente. Essa live, além do Kevin Randle, está aqui conosco o Leonardo Vaz Rodrigues e o Marco Aurélio Seixas. Ela será legendada totalmente em português e em breve será postada no canal João Marcelo. Eu passo a palavra, então, agora ao Marco Seixas e ao Leonardo Vaz Rodrigues, para eles vão dar prosseguimento na live em inglês.
Tá bom, João, obrigado. Thank you, João. Thank you, Leo. Kevin, thank you for being here with us. It's a great honor to have you today to speak with us. Your name is very well known to the Brazilian public, researchers and those interested in the UFO phenomenon. I would like to ask you for your opening remarks, if you wish, and I already take the opportunity to ask that classic question: when and why did you start studying this fascinating phenomenon? Thank you for being with us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here in Brazil. And delighted to hear that people like my work there in Brazil. It's always nice to be appreciated. We spend a lot of time, and I say we, I think of my colleagues here in North America, investigating UFOs and studying UFOs and writing about it. And it's always great to be appreciated in other countries that our work is getting out there and being well known. To answer your question, I always blame my mother for my interest in UFOs. When I was a little kid, and I hate to always say this because it dates me, she took me to the movie Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which I think came out in 1956. And that kind of sparked my interest in UFOs. My mother had an interest in science fiction. And science fiction, of course, is about interstellar flight, alien visitation, alien civilizations, and that sort of thing. And it's not a large step from science fiction into the realm of the UFOs, because we're talking about alien visitation and aliens, civilizations and that sort of thing. So it's always a good thing to have that kind of information available. So I started my research as a youngster, and it was pretty preliminary. In high school, we had a science club, and I did a presentation on UFOs. And the one thing that I always mention in this case is a friend of mine's mother had a UFO sighting. And in this era, the late 1960s, the idea was that UFOs, people seeing UFOs, were just seeing a blob of light in the distance, or they were seeing some indistinct object. And so when I learned that my friend's mother had seen a UFO, I wanted to talk to her about it. And my one question, the only thing I really wanted to answer was, it was distinct. Did it have sharp edges? Was it something indistinct in the distance? And she told me it was hovering about 200 feet over the barn. They lived in South Dakota. And it was very clear and very crisp and very sharp. In fact, sort of gave a lie to some of the information circulating about UFOs being them indistinct blobs of light and could be interpreted in any way. And from that point on, I've always been interested in UFOs and availed myself of an opportunity to invest cases during my military service. And when I say that, when I was in flight school in Fort Walters, Texas, there was a story that came out that a fellow had been not abducted, but invited aboard a flying saucer in a small town near Amarillo, Texas. And because I wasn't that far away from there, I availed myself of the opportunity to go talk to him on a weekend pass. I suspect now he talked to me because my car had a military sticker on it. So he thought it was some kind of probably official investigation. But I had an opportunity to sit down and talk to him about his experiences, and have since concluded it was a hoax. And I think it came out in a few months after that it was a hoax. But I used the opportunities when I was at various military installations to investigate UFOs. So that kind of gets us into it, and it's been sort of a lifelong passion of mine, coupled to the fact that I always wanted to be a writer and had an opportunity to write a number of magazine articles that I say that helped me get through college because I could write a magazine article for one or two of the UFO magazines in the 1970s. And the payment would be just about enough to pay my tuition for a semester. So I always kind of joke about having gone to school on what I called the Saga Scholarship, because that was one of the main magazines doing UFO sightings or reports. So it's been, like I said, it's been a lifelong passion, and it's kind of grown into this thing where I've written so many books about it and studied so many cases and been deeply immersed in the whole phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, and I'd say a very common start in the UFO study, because most people like me started first liking science fiction. I started at my interest first in science fiction and then with ufology. But if you, I want to start our set of questions with Leonardo, and if
well, let me interrupt for just a moment, because you mentioned science fiction, and I kind of skipped over that. One of my goals in life had been to be a science fiction writer, and a friend of mine, Bob Cornett, who just passed away on April 1st. And I would go to science fiction conventions with an idea to meeting the editors, the people who bought the book, so they would know who we are. And so the first things that we had written, or I had written in a book length format, were science fiction novels. So I have a number of science fiction novels that I've published as well. And do a blog called the Science Fiction Site, where we publish some short stories and my thoughts on science fiction. So I have that kind of dual personality. I didn't mean to interrupt there, but I thought it kind of fit in with what you were talking about.
The destiny put you on another path. Okay, Kevin, I would like to set foot on Roswell and start our questions. And I will ask Leonardo to make his first question. Leonardo.
So, Kevin, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your work, because in the UFO field, we know that many researchers carry on the research in a way that confirms their beliefs, and you don't, although you might love the field.
Thank you.
And it's quite impressive that you have more than 100 published books. It's amazing. So, my first question is about the Roswell case. In your last two books about it, you said that the case lost its strength and that people want to intrude in the story. After more than 7 decades, what do you think about the incident? And I would like you to talk specifically about the problems with Jesse Marcel's testimony.
I think Jesse Marcel's testimony is going to be quite the question in the future. I think that there's real problems with some of the things he said, and we're trying to think of a way to phrase it here. I guess the embellishment of his war stories, that sort of thing. So there's some problems with Jesse Marcel, and had he been the lone voice in the Roswell case, we certainly could dismiss it. And when I say the embellishment, just of a couple of examples, he mentioned to Bob Pratt, who I had done a lot of investigation in Brazil, by the way. When he was, when Pratt was talking to him, Marcel had mentioned that he'd shot down 5 Japanese planes during the Second World War, and he had been given an air medal for each of those victories. It turns out that Jesse Marcel only had 2 air medals, which were for meritorious service in participation in aerial flight and combat operations. So there was a discrepancy there. Colonel Weaver, who did the Air Force investigation in the mid-1990s, and I've spoken to him a number of times, we seem to be kind of on the same level, Colonel Weaver and I, looking for the truth. He is locked into the Project Mogul explanation. I am not. But it turns out that during the Second World War, they kept track of everybody who shot down enemy planes, whether they were fighter pilots or gunners in bombers. And there was one crewman in bombers who had totaled 17 enemy aircraft destroyed. Marcel's name doesn't appear on any list at all, even getting just a single victory like that. So we have that kind of an embellishment which harms his reputation. But when we move into the Roswell arena and we talk about that specifically, we have corroborative evidence, meaning there were others. Every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff, Colonel Blanchard being the commanding officer in Roswell in 1947, every member of his staff that we were able to talk to confirmed this event. In fact, Major Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, the chief of police, military chief of police, told me specifically that it was extraterrestrial. And when I say that, I should qualify it by saying, I asked him at one point, were we following the right path, meaning Don Schmidt and me? And he said, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. So in essence, he's telling us it's extraterrestrial. Every member of his staff we were able to talk to told us that, with a single exception. I think his name was Barrowclaw. He was one of the ranking officers there. Everybody else, kind of confirmed this. So we don't have Jesse Marcel as a standalone. So we can look at Marcel's testimony and we say, well, he embellished things and he tended to tell tall tales and that sort of thing. So we can weigh his testimony less heavily than some of the others. But the real point is we have that testimony from those others that corroborate that sort of thing. So Jesse Marcel is one of the reasons I say that the evidence isn't as persuasive as it was in the mid-1990s. We've lost a number of witnesses who we accepted as being authentic or honest during our investigation that turned out, with our further investigation, were not being as honest as they could be. I'm thinking of Frank Kaufman, for example. Walter Hott pointed us to Frank Kaufman, and Frank Kaufman was telling us a story about him being deeply involved in the recovery operation and having inside knowledge. We finally learned that Frank Kaufman wasn't who he said he was. He was not a master sergeant as he claimed. His records show he was a staff sergeant, showed he hadn't been trained in intelligence. He was an administrative assistant or worked in administration with the military as opposed to intelligence. And that some of the things he said just simply weren't true. He forged documents. We had copies of the documents. He forges separation papers and that sort of thing. And so we looked at that and we had to expose that. I mean, it was incumbent upon us as investigators, and Don Schmidt and Mark Rodecker and Mark Chesney, I think, were the ones that finally got the evidence showing that Kaufman wasn't being as honest as he could be. And they withheld that information not to protect the Roswell case, but out of consideration for Kaufman's widow. After Kaufman had died, they had been at Roswell and met with her, and she said, well, he's got some documents and some papers. Could you go through those to make sure we've met all the contractual obligations? And they went through that and they discovered the evidence that he'd been making up. They withheld it because they didn't want to embarrass her. They just were waiting for her to pass away, frankly, and before they released it. And once I learned that, I insisted we release it immediately. It just happened to coincide with about the time she passed away. So the information came out, but it was Rodecker, Chesney, and Schmidt who discovered the information and withheld it, not to bolster the Roswell case, but out of consideration for the widow. And I think that was an admirable thing for them to do. I, on the other hand, said, no, we have to release it immediately. But that's what I mean when we say, some of the witnesses have fallen by the wayside. Not Frank Kaufman, Glenn Dennis, the Roswell mortician, whom we also got from Walter Hott, turned out to be lying about the missing nurse and what her name was and his involvement in it. And it took us literally years to get to that point. A fellow named Vic Golyubin spent a great deal of time looking for the nurse. And he was managed to get documents from the American military, found a listing of 125,000 women who had been military nurses in that time frame. Her name never appeared on that list. He got the names of all the women who had served as nurses in Roswell in that time frame, although they didn't appear necessarily in the yearbook. He got the names of all the the nurses at the local hospitals, and her name didn't appear there. So we have. You're talking
about Matilda. Are you talking about Matilda, Kevin? Sorry to interrupt. Are you talking about Matilda O'Donnell?
Yes. Well, all those nurses. He gave us the name Naomi Self, and there was no Naomi Self. Some people have speculated that Matilda may have been the nurse, but there's really no evidence to support that conclusion. But other things he told us just simply didn't pan out as well. So we lost Glenn Dennis, who had been an important witness because he talked about the autopsy there at the base hospital and some of the people who were involved in it. So we eliminate that testimony from the whole case, but we're still left with a great deal of other testimony from witnesses who are credible. And it begins with the sheriff's family, Sheriff Wilcox's family. We talk about Frankie Rowe and her involvement in it, and her father being a firefighter and how he got involved in this sort of thing. So we look at all of that, but if we had the mortician and we had Frank Kaufman telling us the truth, then the case would be much stronger. But it's been weakened by those people clamoring, I guess, for their 15 minutes of fame.
One problem that I see with this kind of testimony is that at one side, the memory play tricks on us, because after many years, many decades, the memory is not the same. We can search certain elements in the story, but the major problem is to forge documents, forge a participation that never occurred. That's the major problem, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right about the problems with memory. And I think when Don and I began the investigation back in early 1989, we weren't aware of those kinds of problems. And I think we were still living in a world where it was considered everything you've seen or heard has been recorded in the brain, somewhat like a video camera, seeing and hearing all. And it's therefore to be accessed if you can access it properly. And I think we've now learned that that's simply untrue, that a lot of stuff that we see and hear is never registered in the brain. We have no memory of it. And it's easy to manipulate those memories by very carefully leading questions. I think Elizabeth Loftus, as a psychologist or a psychologist, demonstrated how easy it is to lead somebody by saying, you're looking at a traffic accident. The thing I remember was her saying, when they asked a question, they would say, did you see the green car before the accident? And suddenly there was a green car added to the testimony because it had been suggested in that fashion. Not meant to lead, but you're absolutely right about the problems with memory. But with Roswell, we do have documentation. We have, of course, the newspaper articles that tells us things. We know that everybody agrees something fell. There's no question about that. Skeptics, debunkers, true believers, everybody, the Air Force believes something fell. The question is, what fell in Roswell in 1947? I think we've eliminated everything. The Air Force did a nice job of limiting everything except Project Mogul. Project Mogul, of course, is eliminated by the basis of Dr. Crary's diary, he being the man running the experiments at Alamogordo in 1947. And for the only launch of a Mogul balloon was flight number 4, and we have documentation flight number 4 never flew. So it could not have dropped the debris. So we're to the point where we've eliminated all the possible explanations. Everybody agrees something fell. We've eliminated all the possible explanations. What are we left with? And I think that's one of the things we have to realize is kind of a strength of the Roswell case. The other thing I should mention is, according to everything that I've been able to find, and I completed a book called Understanding Roswell that just came out not that long ago, and it's somewhat more skeptical, I think, than most Roswell books, most pro-Roswell books. But one of the things I realized as I was working on this book was Mac Brazel, the rancher who found the debris, took a sample of it to the sheriff's office. So when the sheriff called out to the base and Jesse Marcel came out to look at what was going on and discuss it, there were samples of the debris there. He should have recognized it for what it was at that point. But instead, he returns to the base, talks to Colonel Blanchard, who says, you've just got a counterintelligence guy here, take him with you, which would be Sheridan Cavett. Cavett goes with Marcel to the sheriff's office, looks at the debris. Then they go out to the ranch. Now, according to Cavett, when he was interviewed by Colonel Weaver in 1995, said, I recognized the debris on the debris field immediately as a weather balloon, or a balloon, I should say. Well, the question becomes, well, how come you didn't recognize it in the sheriff's office? And if it was recognized in the sheriff's office, then Marcel and Cavett would have never gone to the ranch, and this whole thing would be over with at this point. So we have that real problem there. We also know debris was sent from Roswell to Fort Worth prior to Marcel returning from the debris field with the material. And that was some of the debris that the rancher had brought into the sheriff's office. It was sent on to Washington, D.C. for examination. So we have this idea that it's a weather balloon, but we have great evidence that that's not what it was, based on those facts and the fact that, according to the documentation available, the documentation supplied by the Air Force, by the way, was that flight number 4, the culprit, didn't fly. It says right there, did not launch the balloons today. Why is that an ambiguous statement? It should be very clear. We didn't fly this cluster of balloons, this array of balloons today. Later on, they flew a cluster of balloons which had a microphone. It never got off the White Sands missile range or the Alamogordo test sites. It was not a full mogul array. It was just a couple of balloons with a microphone on it so they could test the idea of receiving the sound of a blast at altitude. And that's what they were trying to do, put a microphone into the atmosphere high enough over the Soviet Union so if they had detonated an atomic weapon, we would have another way of detecting that detonation. Of course, the U-2 supplanted the balloon idea. But the real point is that flight number 4 didn't fly. It couldn't have left the debris on the Brazel Ranch, and we know the debris went to the sheriff's office. So that's something that's all explained, I think, in detail in Understanding Roswell.
Okay, you already answered my following question. I would ask you why the Project Mogul explanation doesn't work for Roswell, but you said that there was no launch, no balloon launch on that specific day.
There was no, yeah, and that's clarified. I asked Colonel Weaver about that at one point, and his idea was that this cluster of balloons with a microphone would have been what was found, but that cluster of balloons didn't include ray wind targets. The other thing that's not discussed about this is that once they got to New Mexico and you look at the arrays they were flying there, flight number 5, for example, the very next array, has no ray wind targets on it. And if there were no ray wind targets, then that negates the pictures taken in General Ramey's office, which was a degraded ray wind target as the metallic debris that had been recovered. So we have the evidence to negate the entire mogul explanation from Dr. Crevy's diary and the evidence and the testimonies that we've gathered since then.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much. Leonardo, quer fazer alguma pergunta?
Yeah, I do. So, Kevin, you wrote a book about UFO crashes, where you show us that the majority of the stories are mistakes and hoaxes. So I would like you to talk about this book a little bit and about the influence of the Roswell case in all of that.
I think that we have to look at interstellar flight as being a very difficult task. We can't do it, and we really know no way to do it. But I think that if we look at it that way, that the visitation is going to be very rare. I've seen lists of 300 supposed crashes. Most of them are single witness, or the evidence is very, very weak for that sort of thing. And I think it's important for us to take a look at that. I at one point was suggesting there were a handful of crashes, 4 or 5. I'm thinking, of course, Roswell. I thought Kingman, Arizona for a while, but I think that's been pretty well proven to be a hoax. I was Kecksburg, and I'm now kind of leaning toward the natural phenomena meteor for Kecksburg. Shag Harbor, I think of that more as a emergency landing type situation where the object went into the ocean. There's very good documentation for this. It's not really a crash and nothing was recovered. But there's a great number of witnesses. There's a photograph of the object in the sky. And of course, the Canadian military, as did the American military, did a great deal of effort trying to recover whatever it was. And it was seen to leave on sonar or something like that in the days that followed. So the object left the Shag Harbor area. So I look at all of that sort of information, and I'm kind of worried about all these other crashes where we have a little bit of information, but not really enough to follow up on it or get a good handle on it. And I think some of it is just misinterpretations, meteor falls, rockets that have gotten off. There was pictures that were printed just a few weeks ago of here's the authentic pictures of the Roswell crash. And you look at the pictures and it looks suspiciously like an aircraft accident. And I think they finally found the source of those pictures. It was an aircraft accident. Photographs were published on the National Geographic's website at one point, so that we can identify that as not being the Roswell crash or any alien craft. But I think that we have to take a look at the whole body of testimony and see where it takes us. I did an article on my blog not that long about a crash in Louisiana that may have been a missile fired by the United States Navy that was off course, but I don't have a real good explanation for this one. So this is another interesting case, and it was something that I stumbled onto. I'm not really sure how I came across it, but I did an entry on my blog about the whole thing and where the evidence came from the Project Blue Book files and what the Project Blue Book files said and what some of the witnesses said. Took place near Fort Polk, Louisiana. For those of you who are looking at your map and wondering where it is, where the crash site was, it was near Fort Polk, Louisiana. So I wanted to discuss this idea, but I think it was important that we discuss it not from the idea that flying saucers are raining from the sky. There was a good case I'm sure you're familiar with from Ubatuba, Brazil in 1957.
Ubatuba.
I was looking, I think Jacques Vallée in his book Trinity said that the original information came from the 1930s and it did not become known until September of 1957 when the radio or magazine writer in Brazil got a hold of it, and the samples went to eventually to Carl Lorenzen, or samples of it went to Carl Lorenzen in Arizona, the Area Phenomena Research Organization, and that evidence has been looked at and examined many, many times by many, many organizations, including laboratories there in Brazil and the United States Air Force, and it always cracks me up. Lorenzen sent a small sample of the material to the Air Force for analysis, and they managed to destroy it without getting a good spectroscopic reading of it. And they called it or asked, well, we've lost our sample. Can you send us another one? And Carl Lorenzen refused. And I'm thinking, yeah, getting a piece of an alien spacecraft is a very rare phenomenon, and I'm not inclined to be handing these things out if you guys are just going to burn them up by accident. So, and that's a very, very interesting case, and I really don't know what to make of it because we don't have a good chain of custody from the crash on the beach to the reporter. Once it gets to the reporter, then we have a good chain of custody until it gets to the Lorenzens, and then they lost track of it for a while and finally found it again. And I think it was analyzed just recently at Stanford in California. And I cannot remember the name of the scientist for the life of me at the moment, but was intrigued by it. So here's a sample of material that apparently was recovered from an exploding UFO, exploding flying saucer, that has some interesting history behind it, and we don't have a good explanation for what it was. So that would be another interesting crash, but very few cases have that kind of stuff. It's usually just a family story. And well, we had a picture, but we've lost it over the years. Or we wrote it down in a diary, but we've lost the diary. And I was about to go to New Mexico to search for one of the diaries. And I was talking to Tom Carey about it. And he said, yeah, he had been there and talked to the family about it. And it was out in one of their outbuildings in New Mexico, which was filled with rattlesnakes and scorpions, two of my very favorite things. And he said that just never surfaced again. And I've run into that a number of times where we've been chasing down photographs or diaries or letters, and we just can never get to the person that actually holds those documents.
You mentioned the Ubatuba case, but we have another alleged case of UFO crash at Varginha. I don't know if you are aware of this case. Is perhaps the most well-known case of UFO crash and a capture of an alien creature in Brazil. But what causes me some kind of curiosity is that all those crashes or forced landings of objects of unknown nature places your country and our country too as the most dangerous place in the universe for an alien civilization to visit. If we imagine that UFO crashes is a phenomenon not restricted only to Brazil or to the USA, but is a worldwide phenomenon, don't you think that it's strange that the only evidence in the vast majority of cases is the testimonies of supposed witnesses? Okay, it's a break on the chain of custody, but mostly we have only testimonies.
I think part of the problem is, and it's one of the things we've discussed with the Roswell case, and let me point out that looking at it, it is a worldwide phenomenon, and there are reported crashes all over the world. I think, if there was a crash in the Soviet Union, that information would have been restricted, and we wouldn't have a whole lot of information and an ability to investigate it. So we have to look at that. And there was a number of crashes reported in Sweden. And I still not sure exactly what's going on there. I talked to Klaus Sven not too long ago about the ghost rockets and what was the solution. And he said, we still don't know what they were. The idea was a Soviet attempt to intimidate the Swedish government doesn't work. There's some very good cases. So we've got the worldwide phenomenon going on there, the crashes around the world. I would think that if I was an alien race visiting Earth and I realized that there was an area where they were sending rockets into space and they had tested atomic weapons, which would be New Mexico. The Trinity site is not that far from White Sands. In fact, the Trinity site is on the White Sands Proving Ground. I would be interested in that. Are these people who are launching these rockets and have this atomic capability, are they a danger to us being the alien race? And I would want to check on that. So that would explain the interest in that area. And I would think they would have the same interest in the Soviet Union, who was also doing those sorts of things, and some of the other countries like France and Great Britain and China, who are all now moving into that arena as well. But I think that the problem is with Roswell, where it fell was very desolate in 1947 and is not that well populated in today's environment. So that the military was able to contain the information, and they had a lower headquarters, which would be the 509th Bomb Groups, talking about, yes, we've captured a flying saucer in the Roswell region. They don't really describe exactly what they have. They said, well, it's been sent to higher headquarters, and the higher headquarters says, well, no, it's a weather balloon, and that kills the story at that point. So the point here is, however, that you've got an ability to contain the information. In today's environment, everybody and his brother and sister with a cellular phone would be out there recording this stuff, and there would be no way to contain the information. But in New Mexico in 1947, it was something easy to do. And so I think that also leads us to the conclusion that this is a very rare phenomenon, the idea of a UFO crash, because if they were falling from the sky and the numbers that have been claimed by some people, then there would be that cell phone footage out there available to everybody to see. There'd be no way to contain it. So I think that's part of the problem. I think, and that relates to the cases in Brazil as well. At the time these took place, it's much easier to contain the information than it would be in today's environment. And I know that, and I run into this prejudice myself, talking about some of the events in Brazil in presentations I've made, and some people would be dismissive of it. Well, that's South America. We can't believe what's going on down there. I'm thinking, well, the people there are well educated as we are. They're as intelligent as we are. They wouldn't be as fooled by something mundane like a lot of people are. I mean, we have to look at it from the point of view of what evidence is presented. So I think there's that kind of prejudice going on as well. And it may be not just we in North America looking at South America that way, but Europeans looking at that way of North America, or that sort of thing. So we have those kind of biases, as I think did inhibit the sharing of information. The other thing is Bob Cornett, and I mentioned him earlier, and I had written a science fiction story about a vampire. I mean, a real honest to goodness vampire. The guy's really a vampire. And the reporter finds out, he's a vampire. And he says to the vampire, I'm going to tell the world about you. And the vampire says, go ahead. Nobody's going to believe you anyway. And that's kind of where we are with the UFOs. Well, go ahead. Nobody's going to believe you anyway. And they've done such a good job of ridiculing the witnesses. They've done such a good job of belittling the idea. The idea is that here in the United States, if you're a witness to a UFO, you're poorly educated, you have 3 teeth, and you wear bib overalls, and you live on a farm. When you look at the actual witnesses, you discover that the higher the education level, the more urban they are, the better they dress. And if the sighting lasts more than a minute, it's going to be pretty much inexplicable, because people can recognize what is going on. And I think that's the way it is throughout a lot of the world, that if you talk to the right people about the sightings and what's going on, you're going to get much better information. And the idea that it's just the people, and I don't know if you have the term tinfoil hat wearing brigade, the people who wear the tinfoil on their hat to mask the signals from outer space. Or
aluminum hat. It's an aluminum hat, something like that.
Yes, but it's a conspiracy theory. Well, you can't believe those conspiracy theories. So they've done a good job of ridiculing it and creating this curtain of ridicule and laughter to kind of inhibit the free flow of information. And we still run into that today, talking to witnesses. Well, I don't want my name associated with this because I don't want people laughing at me, even though I think that kind of phenomenon is long gone, that people are now more willing to accept the information that you've seen something inexplicable. May not be an alien spacecraft, but it's something that's inexplicable.
Okay, that's perfect. João Marcelo has a question, but I will ask first Leonardo if he has something to ask you, Leonardo.
Yeah, Kevin. By the way, you made several criticisms about Jacques Vallée's book Trinity, in which he mentions a UFO crash before Roswell. Do you still have this opinion?
I think my opinion is even tougher than it was. The idea of Trinity, the book Trinity, is made up of, I think, 3 witnesses, 2 who may still be alive. One of the 2 eyewitnesses to the crash, the alleged crash, is dead. The other one wasn't even born when it happened, so I'm not sure how she could have been an eyewitness. So it all boils down to this guy named Remy Baca. Talking to Don Schmidt just a couple of weeks ago, and I actually have the interview up on my blog that you can listen to it. We discussed Trinity. And according to Don, Baca had approached him in the late 1990s after Don had made a presentation in LA, talking about this crash in San Antonio, New Mexico. But at the time he talked to Don, it was part of the San Agustin crash that he was discussing, and it didn't happen in 1945. It happened in 1947. He also approached Stan Friedman, and Stan Friedman had the same negative reaction, that this doesn't make a lot of sense. So we've got 2 people who were in contact with Baca prior to Paula Harris interviewing him and bringing Jacques Vallée into it. The story reads an awful lot like the Roswell case when you read parts of their discussion of what they found and what they saw. The 2 young boys who were 7 and 9 at the time. The other problem I had as a military officer, and having been both the intelligence officer and the security manager for our unit when we were in Iraq, I'm well aware of how some of these things work. And we have a crash of a mysterious object in New Mexico in 1945. The military comes in to recover it. They treat it like it's just nothing. They load the craft up on a flatbed truck, and then they all head out to lunch. They don't guard it overnight. They don't put any security up on this thing. They just allow these 2 young boys to roam around on the site. And then they say, well, they didn't take all the material. They kicked some of it under bushes. They buried some of it. They didn't get all the material. And well, can we go look at it today? Well, no, you see, there's been floods through there and it's buried under 20 feet of what we call overburden now in the gold mining business. So there's a great deal of problems with the story. And there's just basically a single witness to it. I'm not sure that I think Paula Harris may have talked to the other fellow at one point. The documentation I have goes back to 2010 on it. And like I said, Don Schmidt talked to the guy. And so I have no reason to doubt what Don said, especially when it was corroborated by things that Stan Friedman said. So I think the story is very, very weak. And I think one of the things that turned off Don on this was the guy said, well, how can I make money on this story? So it's like he's being prepped on how can I create a story and what do I need to do so I can make some money on it. And that's kind of where it is. The debris that they supposedly picked up, they used for Christmas decorations, for crying out loud. This foil-like material they talk about, well, we used it. We gave it to all the relatives and we're using it on our Christmas trees for decorations and that sort of thing. Well, do you have any of it now? No, it's all disappeared over the year. Well, isn't that convenient? There's 2 pieces of debris they supposedly had analyzed, but they look like they're parts to a windmill. And I think there's information about this on my blog when after I interviewed Jacques Vallée about it, and Paula Harris was on the same program with Jacques Vallée about that. And there was some other information that came out about that debris being not extraterrestrial in manufacture. So I don't know why Jacques Vallée allowed himself to be dragged into this. Don and I discussed the motivation for that. And the only thing that Don could come up with, it was kind of the old man's disease, meaning, I've got just a few years left. I've got to get to the answer. And it was a way of trying to force the answer out. He said that Alan Hynek had kind of suffered from that too prior to his death, that he realized the time was getting short and he wanted to get the answers before he passed. But no, it's a terrible book. It's got a lot of irrelevance in it, and the military just does not operate, in their view, doesn't operate the way the military should in coordinating the area, recovering the material, whatever it may have been, and keeping a close guard on that before they got out of the area. But we can find nothing to substantiate this story at all.
Once again, the problem of the chain of custody in the Trinity case.
Well, it's not really a chain of custody here. It's the fact that we've got a single witness who was, 7 years old at the time of the event, talking about it in the late 1990s and moving the site around and moving the dates around and moving all the other pieces around to fit into something. So I just don't see it happening. And then it is at the Trinity site, which makes a little bit of sense there. If I'm an alien race and I've discovered that we have atomic weapons, Trinity site would be something that would have drawn my attention if I was in a position to have seen the blast from Trinity from my outer space platform. But I just don't see any persuasive evidence in that book that we should take it other than a rather poor science fiction story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. I have a question here from João Marcelo. He asks you to talk about the Roswell's lives, which were presented as a proof. That money was presented as a proof and commercially exploited by Jaime Maussan. And he asks you if this event, it was a major event, had scratched the image of serious researchers like Donald Schmidt, for instance.
I would like to see, I see the note up on private chat, and I can almost read it because I know I can read some Spanish, so I could almost read that question.
Let's talk in Portuguese from now on.
Yes, I know it's in Portuguese, and that's what I'm saying. I could speak some Spanish, and there's some, as you know, there's some conspiracies between Spanish and Portuguese. So I could puzzle it out, and I could see Jaime Maussan's name and Don Schmidt's name. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that harmed the Roswell case because of what happened. but I'm not sure that we need to. Well, we can point a finger at Don Schmitt and Tom Carey because I think they went into this thing with a will to believe and they accepted it. I was always of the opinion it was kind of alien autopsy light, meaning we don't have video footage, but we do have pictures. And wondering if it was possible that this was a mummy, because I couldn't think of anything else. I'd looked through the science fiction movie. I have a big book on science fiction movies, and I was looking for a movie that would predated the Roswell case where there would be something like this. And in most of the science fiction movies, the alien creatures were always humans, maybe dressed up in strange costumes or something like this, but they not the kind of makeup we get today. I couldn't find anything in the science fiction literature that would lead us to these photographs. And the only thing I could think of was mummies. And Tom Carey said, no, it's not a dummy. We've looked. But I think they came into a will to believe. And the guys who presented it to them had a good story, did not allow them to see the slides themselves other than on a small slide viewer. So it was very difficult to see what was going on, but then gave them a scanned copy that was somewhat cropped. So they didn't get to see the whole thing. And the slides themselves, when they were looked at by Kodak, said, yeah, the film was manufactured in 1947. Of course, it could have been manufactured in 1967 or 1927. I think they recycled the coatings every 20 years. But the coating was right. The slide mount was right for the time. So they had that sort of thing going on. And I think what was going on is the two guys who presented them with the slides were manipulating the situation, telling them things that simply weren't as accurate as possible. Well, here's a picture of Dwight Eisenhower, later president, but General Eisenhower in his uniform. And I said, the slide's reversed. It's backwards. The ribbons are on the wrong side. It makes me suspicious. Things like that. And then we couldn't see the whole picture. Once a higher quality scan got out after the presentation, I mean, it took like 48 hours for it to be decoded. I was wondering why Stan Friedman hadn't been there in Mexico City, because you would think, here's a presentation that's going to just blow the lid off the Roswell case. Why isn't Stan Friedman there? He surely would have been invited by Jaime Maussan to be there, but Stan Friedman didn't go. And I found out that Stan didn't want to go because he knew what the slides were. He knew it was of a mummy. A team had gotten a better copy of one of the scans some weeks prior to the presentation in Mexico City, had decoded the first line. They could read the first line, deblurred the first line, and informed Stan what it said. So he declined to go. And Stan confirmed this to me. So
did he ever talk about it in public? Did he ever talk about it, of his impressions?
No, he stayed away from it. He stayed away from it completely. But the point is, the slide was decoded weeks before, just a few weeks before the presentation in Mexico City. And I think Jaime Maussan, and I don't want to, I want to explain, I can see where he would be somewhat reluctant to accept this, given all the work and money that he'd put into preparing this presentation in Mexico City. So I think he would be reluctant to accept this without real solid proof. And I know once the whole thing was deblurred, the whole placard was deblurred, so it could be read. Don accepted that relatively quickly. Tom was more reluctant to accept it because of some of the things that he had seen and he had heard. Thought there was still something to it. I know one of the anthropologists they talked to, the fellow in, was it Dobler in Canada, after the slide had been deblurred, said, well, this is just not true, because, I looked at this mummy from an anthropological point of view. I think he was a forensic anthropologist or a physical anthropologist. And he said it just didn't have human traits. It didn't have enough ribs or things like that. And I'm thinking we're looking at a dummy. Not a dummy, but a mummy. And I know Jaime Maussan fought that for a while as well. I think we've all come to accept it. But I think it's also important to point out in my book, Roswell in the 21st Century, I go through this whole Roswell slides at length because I think it's important for us to understand the processes that go on. And in the end, it might have been the skeptical community who blurred the entire placard and let that information out, and then shared the way it was done with everybody, including the scan. So if you didn't believe what their interpretation was, here's how we did it. You can do it the same way. And then a number of people inside the pro UFO community had done the same thing and says, yeah, that's what it says. It's clearly a mummy in a museum setting. And then the pictures of the mummy were found at its discovery in 1897, I think it was, in one of the pueblos or cliff dwellings in the southwestern United States. And it was in a museum for a while. Then it went back to, it was sent to another museum. And I think the remains have been returned to the tribal elders for proper burial, which is the way it should be, by the way. But I think that it of course hurts the Roswell case, because here's another example of great excitement about photographic evidence, and then it of course blows up in our face. So yeah, I think it was. I don't think it was as harmful as the alien autopsy, because it took a lot longer to get to that. And here, I guess, with the Roswell slides, it's sort of a case of mistaken identity. By looking at the photographs, where in the alien autopsy, it was a hoax from the get-go, and the people who created the dummies confessed that they had done it, and here's how we did it, and here are photographs of it in various stages of its being created, and all of that sort of thing. So I don't think it was as harmful as the alien autopsy was, but it certainly did harm the Roswell case. I know Don was quite upset by it. Tom was quite upset by it, and some of the others who were kind of sucked into it were upset by it. But it also kind of reflects the will to believe, and I think that those of us, regardless of the side of the fence we're on, whether we're on the believer side or the non-believer side, we tend to look at the evidence that supports our conclusion and put that forward. I try to present both sides when I'm doing my books. Here's what we know, here's what we think, here's what we can prove. But I also admit freely that I think my bias comes out in my books, although I try to keep my bias out of the books and present the information in the most dispassionate way that I can.
Kevin, a curiosity, when you talk about the autopsy video, what was your reaction when you saw that video?
I got to see it. I think it was Channel 4, BBC 4 from the United Kingdom, took a bunch of us down to Roswell. Tom, I'm not sure if Tom was there or not, but Don was there, and we saw the video before it was released publicly. And I looked at it, and it just didn't look quite right to me, but I did not have enough information to kind of make the call on it. By the time they did the documentaries on television around the world, I was pretty well convinced it was a hoax. One of the things that gave it away is we were looking at the debris in the tent, and you look at the debris, and there was this alleged I-beam. And you look at it, it was a very stylized lettering on the side of it, and it said video. And I'm thinking, what are the odds that an alien race would come up with a language and a symbology for that language, and when you put it on the I-beam, although it would say something completely different to them, it says video. And what we have is a video of this I-beam. I mean, that just seemed to be an impossible connection to make. So that made me very suspicious of the thing once I saw that. I was a little bit leery about the way it came about, and the fact that the cameraman wouldn't be identified. the way he supposedly talked about the how he ended up with the footage didn't make sense, because the documents, the footage, the film was supposedly top secret. And I know when you're filming a top secret event, whatever it might be, they count the actual number of frames. So to lose originally what was supposed to be like 2.5 hours of footage just didn't make any sense to me, and that they would let it go missing that long before anybody came to talk about it. And then he didn't want his name out because the government would come after him. And I'm thinking, the government knows who you are. If you were the real cameraman, they've got a list of everybody who was there as a cameraman. This guy, they would know who had let it go. And the other thing is the IRS would be looking for the guy, because he was supposedly paid $100,000 for the footage. And if he didn't declare it on his income taxes, then he would be liable for tax evasion. But my initial reaction was, let's wait and see. I'm a little bit leery. And then once I learned more about it, it became clear to me that it was a hoax. I think Kent Jeffrey had flown over to London and looked at it. And his initial reaction when he saw it in London was it was a hoax, and did a long article in the MUFON Journal about his reactions and seeing the footage at that time. And there were other aspects of it. The classification label supposedly on the cans disappeared once it was pointed out that the U.S. government had never used those kind of classification notifications on documents or film or whatever. So there were a lot of problems that came up from people who didn't understand exactly how these things worked.
Okay. There's always a missing piece on those blockbuster cases, videos, photographs. There's always one or many pieces missing on this huge puzzle. Leonardo has another question to you. Leo?
Yeah, Kevin, I would like to talk about Donald Keyhoe a little bit. Some researchers claim that he was the main responsible for spreading conspiracy theories. Which contributions did he bring to the ufology field, and which harm did he cause to it?
I don't think he really caused any harm. I think Don Keyhoe had a narrow focus, and that was the problem that kind of set him up against APRO at the time. Keyhoe wanted congressional investigations. He wanted congressional hearings, and he tended to stay away from the sensational aspect of it, like the Villas-Boas case. He wouldn't want to get near that because of the implications there. For the longest time, NICAP and his organization didn't really look at cases where the occupants were reported. The Air Force, the United States Air Force, for example, policy was if you saw occupants, well, then clearly you had a psychological problem. I think there's like 3 cases in the Blue Book files in which occupants were seen that the Air Force didn't label as an Air Force, as a psychological problem. The Zamora case in New Mexico in 1964 being one of those, for example. But I think that Keyhoe had inside sources that was feeding him some information, and he got a lot of stuff right. But he also made some mistakes. And the one that I came across, I was looking at the Thomas Mantell case. He's the National Guard pilot, Air National Guard pilot, who was killed chasing a flying saucer in 1948. I am convinced he saw a skyhook balloon, and that was a classified project at the time. And there was a balloon in the area that he could have seen. And at the distance he would have seen it, it would have had a silvery disc-like shimmer to it. And it would have been at 80 or 90,000 feet. And his F-51 fighter had no capability of getting anywhere near that altitude. But he made a statement in the book saying that in these 2 cities in Kentucky, he took the time it was seen in one city and the time it was taken in another city and divided that by the distance, and came out with the idea that the object had been moving at over 200 miles an hour. And said, well, it couldn't have been a balloon because it was moving too fast. But if you take a look at where the cities are situated and where the skyhook balloon was, and if you had people looking, one guy looking to the east and one guy looking to the west, and the balloon is sort of between the 2 of them, then you don't really have that sort of speed. It depends on when it was spotted in one and when it was spotted in the other, and the calculation of speed was inaccurate. I know that the people in Godman Tower, which is Godman Army Airfield, which is Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I think, were watching the balloon for a long time, and there's drawings in the Project Blue Book files of what looks like a skyhook balloon. I mean, they're talking about it being an ice cream cone shaped, and that basically was a skyhook balloon when you got a good enough look at it. And it would reflect the sun and things like that. Brad Sparks disagrees with me. He thinks I'm completely wrong, but I think the evidence is pretty persuasive. So, that kind of gives you an idea of how those things work out. But I think that, we've got to take a look at the whole picture when we're trying to understand that sort of thing.
Okay, Kevin, I like to make one final question. We have almost 1 hour of live. We don't want to take much of your time. I just want to ask you to say something. It seems that the UFO community lives inside a bubble. The believers don't want to leave the bubble, and the skeptics can't get in the bubble. Do you believe that at some point this bubble will burst and thus show that what we believed in for over 70 years was nothing more than perhaps a big mistake, something related exclusively to the human being, his state of mind, mental illness not fully understood? What do you think about this?
I think there is a component to that where people kind of identify ambiguous stimuli based on their belief structure. That my PhD dissertation was done on the identification of belief structure influencing identification of ambiguous stimuli, which means if I believe I'm heavily religious and I see a fuzzy object in the distance, I interpret it as an angel or a ghost. Whereas if I have a more scientific mind and I believe in UFOs, I interpret it as an alien spacecraft. And so there's a component to that where your belief structure influences how you identify these ambiguous stimuli. And it's true, I think, that the true believers are in a bubble and they don't want to hear any information that would suggest something otherwise. And I think the skeptics and the debunkers sometimes don't want to hear any evidence that would suggest that there may be something anomalous going on out there, and it may lead us to the extraterrestrial explanation. The only way I think the bubble is going to be burst is if we get some kind of a terrestrial answer that explains it in a way that is obvious and cannot be refuted. We have, this is what we're seeing. Or one lands and the other side has said, well, we were wrong. There's the spacecraft sitting on the lawn waiting to talk to us, that kind of thing. I don't think that disclosure, I did a book called UFOs in the Deep State not that long ago. And what the idea is, the deep state's going to keep this under wraps because the idea that there's an alien race that can travel interstellar distances and have a technology far superior to ours is dangerous to their positions in the world today. And so they have no motivation for keeping the information secret. And something's going to have to break that. I believe the bubble will break when we get the landing, when we get the irrefutable evidence. I really don't see how you can convince everybody that there's a terrestrial explanation for all UFO sightings, because I think there's always going to be that one small case where, a number of cases where you just have no explanation.
Okay, Kevin. Well, I think we're done for today. I would like to thank you on behalf of our group. We call our group Identificado, identified. We used to say that we do the B side of ufology. We are not fully skeptics. We are questioning people. And I like to thank you on behalf of our group and our audience for your time. And thank you very much. Hope you have you here with us on another time to talk about other subjects. And that's it. Kevin,
Well,
Brazilian people, thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.